The first mortar shell exploded 30 yards from Private First Class Tommy Martinez, showering him with frozen earth and splintered pine needles. It was September 19th, 1944, and the Hurtgen forest had just claimed its first American blood of what would become the longest single battle the United States Army fought in World War II. Martinez pressed his face against the damp forest floor, breathing in the musty scent of decomposing leaves mixed with curdite. Around him, the men of the 28th Infantry Division spread out in a ragged skirmish line, their olive-drab uniforms already dark with sweat despite the autumn chill. The towering fir trees stretched endlessly ahead, their thick canopy blocking out most of the pale German sky. "Move up. Keep moving." Sergeant Bill O'Connor's voice cut through the whistling of incoming artillery. The Irish-American from Boston had seen action in North Africa and Sicily, but nothing had prepared him for this green labyrinth on the German border. The Hurtgen forest stretched for 50 square miles of dense woodland, a natural fortress that the Wehrmacht had spent months fortifying with bunkers, minefields, and carefully concealed machine gun nests. Lieutenant Colonel James Henderson studied his map with growing unease. According to intelligence reports referenced in Stars and Stripes military newspaper, the German 7th Army had been retreating steadily since the Normandy breakout. The forest should have been lightly defended, a mere speed bump on the road to the Rhine River and the heart of Nazi Germany. Instead, his battalion had advanced barely 2 miles in 3 days, leaving behind a trail of casualties that made his stomach churn. The battle plan seemed straightforward enough on paper. The First Army, under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, would punch through the Hurtgen forest and capture the strategic Roer River dams. Control of those dams would prevent the Germans from flooding the entire Cologne plain and drowning any Allied advance toward the industrial Ruhr Valley. What the planners in their comfortable headquarters had failed to grasp was the nightmarish terrain that awaited the American infantry. Martinez crawled forward through the undergrowth, his M1 Garand rifle clutched tight against his chest. Every tree could hide a sniper. Every fallen log might conceal a mine. The Germans had transformed this ancient woodland into a killing field, using the natural advantages of thick forests to negate American superiority in tanks and air support. The tall firs grew so close together that Sherman tanks could barely squeeze between them, and their thick canopy rendered tactical air strikes nearly impossible. Behind him, Martinez could hear the labored breathing of Corporal Eddie Kowalski, a factory worker from Detroit who had been drafted just 8 months earlier. None of them were truly ready for this kind of warfare. They had trained for fast-moving advances across open country, not this claustrophobic nightmare where death lurked behind every tree trunk. The sound of machine gun fire erupted from their right flank, followed by the terrible screams of wounded men. German MG-42 machine guns, with their distinctive tearing sound, swept the forest floor with deadly precision. The enemy had studied American tactics and learned to position their weapons to create interlocking fields of fire that turned simple advances into suicide missions. As darkness began to fall on that first day, Martinez found himself sharing a shallow foxhole with 3 other soldiers, all of them shivering in the gathering cold. None of them could have imagined that they were entering what historians would later call the longest single battle in United States Army history, a meat grinder that would consume entire divisions and haunt the survivors for decades to come. By October 10, 1944, the Hurtgen forest had earned a new nickname among the American troops, the Death Factory. Private Martinez had somehow survived 3 weeks of the most intense combat he could have imagined, watching as his unit was systematically torn apart by an enemy that seemed to materialize from the very trees themselves. The morning began with the familiar routine of artillery preparation. American howitzers pounded suspected German positions for 30 minutes, their shells exploding harmlessly against the thick forest canopy or burying themselves in the soft earth without causing significant damage to the well-constructed German bunkers below. When the barrage lifted, Martinez and the surviving members of his squad moved forward once again into the Green Maze. Staff Sergeant Frank Mueller, recently promoted after his predecessor stepped on a mine, led the advance with the cautious movements of a man who had learned to read the forest's deadly signs. Every depression in the ground might hide an anti-personnel mine. Every cluster of bushes could conceal a machine gun nest. The Germans had perfected the art of defensive warfare in this terrain, creating killing zones that channeled American attacks into predetermined areas, where concentrated firepower could inflict maximum casualties. The psychological warfare was just as effective as the physical combat. German loudspeakers hidden throughout the forest would broadcast propaganda messages in perfect English, describing the warm meals and comfortable beds waiting for American prisoners of war Sometimes, they would play American popular music, including recordings of songs that reminded the homesick soldiers of sweethearts and families thousands of miles away. When that failed to demoralize the advancing Americans, they would broadcast the sounds of crying babies or screaming women, psychological torture designed to break the will of men already pushed to their mental limits. Corporal Kowalski had not spoken a coherent sentence in 5 days. The once cheerful factory worker now moved like a sleepwalker, his eyes vacant and unfocused. Combat fatigue was claiming almost as many casualties as German bullets, but the advancing American forces had no choice but to continue pushing forward. According to reports later published in Time magazine, the strategic importance of the Roer River dams meant that this battle had to be fought, regardless of the cost in human lives. Martinez crouched behind a fallen oak tree, its trunk scarred by shrapnel and small arms fire. Somewhere ahead, he could hear the distinctive sound of German voices, speaking in the guttural tones that had become the soundtrack of his nightmares. The enemy was close, probably no more than 50 yards away, but the thick undergrowth made accurate target identification nearly impossible. Lieutenant Henderson studied his watch and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His orders were to take Hill 409 by 1700 hours, and he had barely 2 hours left to accomplish the mission. The hill was no more than a gentle rise in the forest floor, insignificant except for the German observation post that commanded a view of the entire American advance. Taking it would require a frontal assault across open ground swept by interlocking machine gun fire. The attack began at 1530 hours with a brief artillery preparation that accomplished nothing except to alert the German defenders. Martinez found himself running through the forest undergrowth, his heavy equipment bouncing against his back as machine gun bullets whined overhead. Men were falling all around him, cut down by enemy fire that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. The carefully planned infantry assault dissolved into chaos within minutes, leaving wounded Americans scattered across the forest floor like broken dolls. By nightfall, the Americans had advanced exactly 37 yards at a cost of 23 casualties. Martinez spent another sleepless night in a muddy foxhole, listening to the moans of wounded comrades who lay between the American and German lines. The forest had become a no-man's land where the dead and dying disappeared into the dark earth, feeding the soil that would nurture new growth when this madness finally ended. As October drew to a close, the 28th Infantry Division existed only as a name on organizational charts. The unit had been effectively destroyed, its combat effectiveness reduced to nearly zero by weeks of continuous fighting in impossible conditions. November 1st, 1944, brought the arrival of the 4th Infantry Division, fresh replacements thrown into the Hurtgen meat grinder to continue the advance that had already consumed the full American divisions. Private Martinez, now one of the most experienced soldiers in his depleted company, watched the newcomers with a mixture of pity and envy. They still possessed the confidence and optimism that the forest had stripped from the survivors of the original assault. Major General Raymond Barton, commanding the 4th Infantry Division, established his headquarters in the village of Zweifall, just outside the forest's edge. The general was a veteran of the Great War who understood the brutal mathematics of infantry combat, but even his experience had not prepared him for the unique challenges of forest warfare against a well-prepared enemy. His division had already distinguished itself in the Normandy campaign, but the Hurtgen forest would test every lesson learned in previous battles. The Germans had used the brief lull in fighting to strengthen their defensive positions even further. Major General Friedrich Klein, commanding the 81st Corps, had transformed the forest into a series of interlocking defensive zones that maximized the advantages of terrain while minimizing the effectiveness of American firepower. According to intelligence reports referenced in the New York Times war correspondence, the German defenders included veterans of the Eastern Front who understood how to conduct defensive warfare under the most difficult conditions. 2nd Lieutenant Robert Peterson arrived with the 4th Division replacements, a recent graduate of Officer Candidate School who had trained extensively in small unit tactics, but possessed no real combat experience. Peterson found himself assigned to Martinez's company, where the surviving veterans looked at him with the weary resignation of men who had watched too many young officers die in their first week of combat. The lieutenant's clean uniform and shiny equipment marked him as clearly as if he had worn a target on his back. The November offensive began with the largest artillery preparation yet attempted in the forest battle. American guns fired continuously for 2 hours, expending thousands of rounds in an attempt to neutralize German defensive positions. When the barrage ended, the infantry moved forward through a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon, cratered and torn, but still dominated by the same defensive positions that had stopped previous attacks. Martinez led his squad through the shattered remains of what had once been a small German village. The houses had been reduced to piles of rubble, their cellars converted into fighting positions by German engineers, who understood how to make every structure into a fortress. American tanks attempted to provide support, but the narrow forest paths and German anti-tank guns made armored warfare nearly impossible. In this terrain, the battle for the village of Hurtgen began on November 2nd and continued for 5 straight days. Every house had to be taken individually, room by room and floor by floor. German defenders would retreat from the ground floor to the cellar, then emerge behind advancing Americans to attack from the rear. Booby traps and mines turned every doorway into a potential death trap, while snipers in carefully concealed positions picked off American soldiers who exposed themselves for even a few seconds. Lieutenant Peterson lasted exactly 36 hours before stepping on an anti-personnel mine that removed his left leg below the knee. Martinez helped carry the wounded officer to a casualty collection point, listening to the young man's delirious apologies for failing his men. The forest consumed officers even faster than enlisted men, their leadership responsibilities forcing them to expose themselves to enemy fire while making the tactical decisions that kept their units moving forward. By November 10th, the 4th Infantry Division had suffered over 4,000 casualties while advancing less than 3 miles. The unit's combat effectiveness had been reduced to roughly 30% of authorized strength, with many companies commanded by sergeants because all their officers had become casualties. Martinez found himself acting as squad leader simply because he had survived longer than anyone else, his battlefield promotions coming at the cost of dead comrades rather than demonstrated leadership ability. The psychological toll was becoming as significant as the physical casualties. Combat fatigue cases filled the Division 8 stations. Young men whose minds had simply snapped under the relentless pressure of forest warfare. December 5th, 1944, brought the first heavy snowfall to the Hurtgen forest, transforming the battlefield into a winter wonderland that concealed even deadlier dangers beneath its pristine white surface. Private Martinez, now wearing sergeant's stripes earned through the simple expedient of survival, led his depleted squad through snow-covered undergrowth, where German mines waited like sleeping serpents beneath the innocent-looking drifts. The 9th Infantry Division had replaced the destroyed 4th Division in late November, bringing fresh troops into what was rapidly becoming known as the most costly battle in American military history. Major General Lewis Craig commanded these newcomers with the grim determination of a man who understood that strategic objectives sometimes required tactical sacrifices that would haunt commanders for the rest of their lives. Snow changed everything about forest warfare. The white landscape made movement during daylight hours nearly impossible, as American soldiers in their dark olive-drab uniforms stood out like shadows against the pristine background. German defenders, many of them equipped with white winter camouflage, seemed to materialize from the very snowdrifts themselves. The cold was so intense that weapons froze, medical supplies turned solid, and wounded men died from exposure before they could be evacuated to aid stations. Technical Sergeant William Bradford, a career soldier from the regular army, had assumed command of what remained of Martinez's company after Captain Morrison became another casualty to German artillery fire. Bradford was a professional who had served in the Philippines before the war, but even his extensive experience had not prepared him for the unique challenges of winter warfare. In dense forest terrain, the battle for Hill 401 became the focal point of the December fighting. This unremarkable piece of high ground commanded the approaches to the village of Kleinhau, the next objective in the seemingly endless advance toward the Roer River dams. German forces had fortified the hill with a complex system of bunkers, trenches, and machine gun positions that took full advantage of the natural terrain features. Martinez studied the hill through his binoculars, noting the way the German positions were laid out to create interlocking fields of fire that would sweep any attacking force with deadly crossfire. The snow had filled in many of the shell holes and trenches that might have provided cover for advancing infantry, creating an almost surgical killing field where American casualties could be maximized with minimal German exposure. According to combat reports later analyzed in Infantry Journal, the German defenders included elements of the 344th Infantry Division, veterans who had fought on the Russian front and understood how to conduct defensive warfare under winter conditions. These soldiers knew how to use the cold as a weapon, positioning their defensive lines to force American attacks across frozen streams and up snow-covered slopes where tactical movement became nearly impossible. The December 16th attack on Hill 401 began in a blizzard that reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. Martinez led his squad up the slope through knee-deep snow, each step a monumental effort that left the men gasping for breath in the thin, cold air. German machine guns opened fire when the Americans were halfway up the hill, cutting down the lead elements of the assault force with methodical precision. Private Danny Sullivan, a replacement who had arrived just 3 days earlier, took a machine gun bullet through the chest and fell face first into the snow. The white ground around him turned crimson as his life drained away. Another casualty in a battle that seemed to consume men. Without achieving any meaningful tactical advantage, Martinez dragged Sullivan's body behind a fallen tree, but the young soldier died before medical corpsmen could reach their position. By evening, the Americans had gained exactly 40 yards of worthless forest at a cost of 37 casualties. The hill remained in German hands, its defenders confident that winter weather would do as much damage to American morale as their weapons did to American bodies. That night, Martinez shared a foxhole with Corporal Jenkins, both men shivering in their inadequate winter gear while German artillery shells exploded randomly throughout the forest. The strategic situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The Hurtgen forest battle had consumed 4 full American divisions, without achieving its primary objective of capturing the Roer River dams. January 8, 1945, marked the beginning of what would be the final phase of the Hurtgen forest campaign. Though none of the participants could have known it at the time, Sergeant Martinez, now commanding what remained of his original platoon, received orders that filled him with a familiar mixture of dread and resignation. The 78th Infantry Division, another fresh unit thrown into the forest meat grinder, would make one final attempt to break through German defenses and reach the elusive Roer River dams. Major General Edwin Parker commanded this new division with the desperate energy of a man who understood that military careers and political reputations depended on success. In this godforsaken forest, Parker had studied the tactical failures of previous attempts and believed he had identified the key to victory: concentrated firepower followed by rapid infantry assault. Before German defenders could recover from the bombardment, the plan looked impressive on paper, but Martinez had heard similar optimistic briefings before every previous disaster. The forest had a way of reducing elaborate tactical schemes to simple survival, where individual soldiers made life and death decisions based on instinct rather than doctrine. He had learned to trust his own judgment over the wisdom of staff officers, who planned battles from the safety of heated command posts miles behind the front lines. Captain Robert Hayes, recently promoted from lieutenant after his predecessor became another forest casualty, gathered his company commanders for a final briefing before the assault. According to intelligence reports referenced in Army Times military publication, German defensive strength had been significantly reduced by the extended fighting. At winter weather, the enemy was supposedly running low on ammunition, food, and replacements, making this the perfect time for a decisive breakthrough. Martinez listened to the briefing with the skepticism of a veteran who had survived for months of continuous combat in impossible conditions. He had heard identical intelligence estimates before every previous attack, and each time the Germans had proven stronger and more determined than anticipated. The forest had taught him that intelligence officers were optimists by profession, while infantry sergeants were realists by necessity. The artillery preparation began at 0600 hours on January 15th and continued for 3 solid hours. American guns fired over 10,000 rounds into the German defensive zone, the heaviest bombardment yet attempted in the forest battle. The noise was so intense that men had to communicate by hand signals, and several soldiers suffered permanent hearing damage from the concussion of their own artillery. When the barrage lifted, Martinez led his men forward through a landscape that looked like the aftermath of an earthquake. Trees had been shattered into splinters, the ground was torn by massive craters, and the air was thick with smoke and dust that burned the lungs and stung the eyes. For a few optimistic minutes, it seemed that the bombardment might have actually accomplished its intended purpose. The illusion shattered when German machine guns opened fire from positions that had somehow survived the artillery preparation. The enemy had learned to construct deeper bunkers and more elaborate defensive positions that could withstand even the heaviest American bombardments. Within minutes, the attack had bogged down in the familiar pattern of previous assaults, with American casualties mounting rapidly while tactical gains remained negligible. Private First Class Anthony Ricci, a replacement from New Jersey who had arrived just 2 weeks earlier, took shrapnel from a German mortar round that exploded directly overhead. Martinez crawled to the wounded soldier's position, applying pressure bandages while machine gun bullets whistled overhead. Ricci died while asking Martinez to write a letter to his mother, another young life sacrificed to the strategic imperatives that demanded control of the Roer River dams. By evening, the 78th Infantry Division had advanced approximately 200 yards at a cost of over 300 casualties. The breakthrough that had seemed so promising in the morning briefings had once again failed to materialize, leaving American forces trapped in the same deadly stalemate that had characterized the entire Forest campaign. That night, Martinez found himself questioning the fundamental assumptions that had brought American forces into this green hell. The strategic importance of the Roer River dams was undeniable, but the cost in human lives was approaching levels that challenged basic military mathematics. February 2nd, 1945, brought news that changed everything about the Hurtgen Forest campaign. Though the men dying in the frozen mud could not have anticipated the strategic developments occurring far above their level of responsibility, the Soviet winter offensive had broken German resistance along the entire Eastern Front, forcing Wehrmacht High Command to transfer critical reserves from Western Front defensive positions. To stem the Russian advance toward Berlin, Major General Parker, looking haggard after weeks of inconclusive fighting, explained that German resistance in the forest was finally beginning to weaken as veteran units were withdrawn to face more immediate threats in the east. The long-awaited breakthrough might finally be within reach. The intelligence seemed too good to be true, and Martinez had learned to be suspicious of optimistic reports from higher headquarters. The forest had taught him that German defensive capabilities were consistently underestimated by staff officers who planned battles from comfortable rear area positions. He would believe in weakening enemy resistance only when his men could advance without taking prohibitive casualties. First Lieutenant Michael O'Brien, another replacement officer assigned to Martinez's decimated company, brought news of German defensive preparations that seemed to contradict the optimistic intelligence estimates. Aerial reconnaissance had identified new bunker construction and fresh minefields that suggested continued German commitment to holding the forest defensive line. The enemy might be transferring some units to the Eastern Front, but they were clearly not abandoning their positions without a fight. The February offensive began with familiar ritual of massive artillery preparation, followed by infantry assault across terrain that had been fought over continuously. For nearly 5 months, Martinez led his squad through forest undergrowth where the accumulated debris of previous battles created obstacles almost as dangerous as active enemy resistance. Abandoned equipment, unexploded ordnance, and unburied dead created a nightmare landscape that challenged both physical endurance and mental stability. This time, however, something was genuinely different about German defensive responses. Machine gun fire was less accurate and less sustained than in previous battles. Artillery support was sporadic and poorly coordinated. Most significantly, German defenders seemed more willing to abandon positions under pressure rather than fighting to the death as they had during earlier phases of the Forest campaign. By February 10th, American forces had advanced further in 8 days than they had managed during the previous 4 months of fighting. The village of Schmidt, which had been a major tactical objective since the beginning of the Forest battle, finally fell to elements of the 78th Infantry Division after token German resistance. Martinez walked through the shattered remains of what had once been a picturesque German farming community, noting how thoroughly the extended fighting had destroyed every trace of civilian life. The breakthrough came on February 15th when advanced elements of the 9th Armored Division finally reached the western bank of the Roer River. The strategic objective that had cost for American divisions and over 24,000 casualties had finally been achieved, though the price paid for this success would be debated by military historians for decades to come. According to post-battle analysis published in Military Review Journal, the Hurtgen Forest campaign represented both tactical failure and strategic success. American forces had eventually accomplished their mission of reaching the Roer River dams, but the cost in human lives and military resources far exceeded reasonable expectations. For such limited territorial gains, Martinez stood on the river bank, looking across the dark water toward German positions that were already being abandoned as Wehrmacht forces retreated toward their final defensive lines along the Rhine River. The forest behind him was silent for the first time in 5 months, its shattered trees and shell-torn ground bearing testimony to one of the most costly battles in American military history. March 1, 1945, found Sergeant Martinez standing in a military cemetery outside the Belgian city of Liege, reading the names carved into wooden crosses that marked the final resting places of men who had died in the Hurtgen forest. The cemetery contained over 4,000 graves, each representing a life sacrificed to the strategic imperative of controlling the Roer River dams and advancing toward the heart of Nazi Germany. The Hurtgen Forest campaign had officially ended on February 21, 1945, where the last German defenders withdrew across the Roer River and retreated toward their final defensive positions along the Rhine. American forces had achieved their strategic objectives, but the cost had been almost incomprehensible, for divisions effectively destroyed, over 24,000 casualties, and uncounted psychological wounds that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Martinez carried the roster of his original company, now reduced to a handful of names that represented the few men who had somehow survived 5 months of continuous combat in impossible conditions. Private Danny Sullivan, Corporal Eddie Kowalski, Lieutenant Robert Peterson, and dozens of others had become statistics in a battle that military historians would study for generations, seeking to understand how tactical necessity and strategic imperatives had combined to create such a devastating human cost. Captain Hayes, now commanding a battalion after his predecessor became another forest casualty, had recommended Martinez for promotion to Master Sergeant and assignment to a training unit in the United States. The recommendation cited his exceptional performance under combat conditions and his value as an experienced instructor who could prepare other young men for the realities of modern warfare. Martinez was not sure whether this represented recognition for his service or punishment for his survival. The strategic consequences of the Hurtgen Forest battle extended far beyond the immediate tactical objectives. American control of the Roer River dams had indeed prevented German forces from flooding the Cologne Plain and disrupting Allied advances toward the industrial Ruhr Valley. The extended fighting had also tied down significant German reserves that might otherwise have been available to defend against the final Allied offensive across the Rhine River. According to post-war analysis conducted by the Army Historical Division, the battle represented a case study in the challenges of forest warfare against well-prepared defensive positions. The thick canopy negated Allied advantages in air power, while the dense undergrowth made tank warfare nearly impossible. German forces had maximized the natural advantages of terrain, while minimizing the effectiveness of American firepower superiority. The psychological impact of the forest battle was perhaps more significant than the immediate military consequences. American forces had entered the campaign with the confidence born of previous victories in North Africa, Italy, and France. The Hurtgen Forest taught an entire generation of soldiers that victory could be achieved only through extraordinary sacrifice, and that strategic objectives sometimes required tactical costs that challenged fundamental assumptions about acceptable casualty rates. Martinez received orders transferring him to Fort Benning, Georgia, where he would serve as an instructor in the infantry school's advanced tactics course. His combat experience in the Hurtgen Forest made him invaluable for training the next generation of American infantry officers, men who would need to understand the realities of modern warfare before leading their own soldiers into battle. On his final day in Europe, Martinez returned to the Hurtgen Forest one last time, walking through the silent woods where he had lost so many friends and comrades. The trees were beginning to show signs of new growth, green shoots emerging from soil that had been fertilized by the blood of two armies. Nature was already beginning the long process of healing wounds that would take much longer to heal in the men who had survived this ordeal. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest remained classified as a tactical victory in official Army records, but the men who fought there understood the true cost of that victory. They had accomplished their mission and achieved their strategic objectives, but they had also learned that some victories were so expensive that they challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between military success and human sacrifice. The forest would remember what they had endured, even when the history books reduced their experience to strategic analysis and casualty statistics. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest stands as one of the longest single battles fought by United States forces in World War II, lasting from September 19, 1944 to February 21, 1945. The campaign cost American forces over 24,000 casualties, while achieving the strategic objective of controlling the Roer River dams and preparing for the final Allied offensive across the Rhine River into the heart of Nazi Germany.